The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence. It was the smell. Fresh-cut pine, engine oil, and sawdust had always greeted me before I even stepped out of my truck, but that Sunday evening there was nothing except churned-up dirt and the sharp scent of diesel fuel hanging in the air. I stopped halfway up my driveway because my brain simply refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. My workshop, the little wood shop I'd spent more than 20 years building one project at a time, was gone. Not damaged, not burned, not leaning after a storm, just gone. Scraped clean off the property like it had never existed. For a long minute, I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at an empty patch of ground where my whole retirement had lived. My name is Walter Dawson. I'm 72 years old, a retired cabinet maker living outside Cedar Hollow, Washington. Long before expensive SUVs and fancy entry signs showed up around here, I was building kitchen cabinets, porch swings, rocking chairs, and dining tables for families in this valley. Half the homes people now brag about sitting in that subdivision still have something I built with my own hands, and every scratch on those hands has a story attached to it. That workshop wasn't some old shed full of junk like people love to imagine. Inside were over 200 carefully collected hand tools, shelves filled with hardwood I'd been drying for years, unfinished toy chests for my twin granddaughters, and a 1948 Delta bandsaw that had belonged to my father before it ever belonged to me. I learned to cut straight lines standing beside that machine when I was barely tall enough to reach the table. After Dad passed away, I promised myself I'd never leave the family. Apparently somebody else had made a different decision while I was away visiting my sister for the weekend. I walked across the dirt where the concrete slab had been cracked apart by heavy equipment. There were tire tracks everywhere, broken nails, splintered pieces of oak, and one lonely coffee mug somehow still standing upright on a chunk of concrete. I recognized it immediately. My grandson Ethan had painted it for me when he was 9 years old. That little mug survived, but my entire shop didn't. I picked it up, brushed the dust off with my sleeve, and I don't mind admitting my eyes got watery. You spend decades building something with your own hands. You don't just lose lumber and tools, you lose pieces of your life. Then I noticed the bright orange notice taped to my mailbox. I figured maybe it was some kind of mistake. Maybe an emergency order from the county after somebody reported a dangerous structure. Instead, I unfolded a letter from the Homeowners Association informing me that my non-compliant detached structure had been removed under newly adopted architectural standards. According to the letter, I now owed $16,000 for demolition expenses and another $9,200 for landscape restoration, because the lot had to be returned to community standards. I actually laughed out loud, not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably arrogant that my brain couldn't process it any other way. They demolished my building without permission, then sent me the bill. I slept maybe 2 hours that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing my father's bandsaw being tossed into a landfill somewhere beneath piles of broken drywall and old mattresses. By sunrise, I'd already decided this wasn't something to argue about over emails. I drove straight to the HOA office. Their president, a man named Grant Holloway, had moved into the neighborhood less than 3 years earlier after selling some software company for more money than most of us will ever see. Nice suits, expensive watches, always talking about property values and modernizing the community like he'd personally invented civilization. His office looked exactly like him. Spotless, glass walls, modern furniture that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. He didn't even bother standing when I walked in. He glanced over his tablet and smiled like he already knew why I was there. "Mr. Feet Dawson," he said, "I figured you'd stop by eventually." I laid the demolition notice on his desk. "Where's my workshop?" I asked as calmly as I could. He folded his hands together like he was explaining something to a child. "Your structure violated the revised aesthetic code approved last spring. Multiple notices were issued." I shook my head. I never received a single one. He shrugged without the slightest hint of concern. "Certified mail records say otherwise." I leaned closer. "That building was older than your entire subdivision." He smiled again, the kind of smile that isn't friendly, just expensive. And that's exactly the problem. "Walter, we're building a premium community now. People don't spend $1 million on homes to look at old woodworking sheds every morning." I felt my jaw tighten. That wasn't a shed. He looked out the window toward the neighborhood entrance before saying the sentence I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "Maybe it's time to stop living in the past. Sell the old tools, enjoy retirement, and let the neighborhood move into the future." I stared at him for several seconds without saying a word. 20 years ago, I probably would have lost my temper. At 72, you learn something valuable. The loudest person in the room usually loses. So I picked up the letter, nodded once, and quietly walked out. Grant actually looked disappointed that I hadn't exploded. He thought the conversation was over. What he didn't know was that the moment I got home, I climbed into the attic, pulled down a dusty metal lockbox that hadn't been opened in years, spread every property document I'd kept since buying that land in 1979 across my kitchen table, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and started reading every single page, because something deep in my gut kept whispering that a man who feels untouchable usually isn't paying attention to the ground beneath his own feet. And before midnight, I was looking at one tiny line on an old survey map that made my entire heartbeat slow down. I must have traced that survey line a dozen times before I finally leaned back in my chair and realized I wasn't imagining it. My property boundary didn't stop where the HOA map claimed it did. Not even close. According to the original county survey filed back in 1979, the entire footprint of my workshop sat nearly 12 feet outside the Homeowners Association's legal jurisdiction. At first, I thought maybe I was missing an updated filing. Maybe there had been a boundary adjustment sometime over the years that I'd simply forgotten about. Age has a funny way of making you question your own memory before you question someone else's honesty. So Monday morning, I drove into town and visited someone I hadn't spoken to in almost 5 years. My old attorney, Daniel Pierce. Daniel wasn't just any lawyer. 20 years earlier, I built every cabinet in his first law office, refused to charge him full price because he was just getting started, and later built a baby crib when his daughter was born. We weren't drinking buddies, but we respected each other. When I laid the documents across his conference table, he adjusted his glasses, spent maybe 6 or 7 quiet minutes comparing surveys, deeds, county records, and the HOA charter, then suddenly leaned back and laughed so hard I thought he'd lost his mind. "Walter," he finally said, wiping his eyes, "they didn't just make a mistake. They walked straight into a legal wood chipper." I asked him what he meant. He slid 2 maps beside each other and pointed at one tiny signature block. "See this? When the HOA expanded in 2020, they filed an amended neighborhood plat claiming several parcels voluntarily joined the association. Every owner was supposed to sign consent forms." He tapped my deed. "Your signature isn't here because nobody ever asked you." I frowned. "So they forged it?" "No," he answered. "Something even dumber. They simply listed your parcel anyway." I stared at him. "Can they do that?" He smiled. "Absolutely not." Everything suddenly began fitting together. The letters I'd ignored over the last few years, the landscaping warnings, the paint color notices, the ridiculous complaints about my stack of cedar boards beside the workshop. I paid a few of those fines simply because I figured fighting wasn't worth the headache. Turns out I'd been paying money to an organization that never had authority over my property in the first place. Daniel kept digging. By Wednesday afternoon, he'd uncovered county correspondence showing officials had actually questioned the annexation paperwork years earlier. But the HOA corrected several clerical issues without ever fixing the missing owner consents. Somehow the expansion slipped through anyway, and nobody challenged it because most homeowners assumed everything had been handled legally. Daniel looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Walter, your workshop isn't the biggest story anymore." He was right. It had become much bigger than me. We filed suit that same week, not just for trespass, destruction of property, unlawful demolition, and conversion of personal property, but also for fraudulent governance and unauthorized fee collection. The estimated value of my destroyed shop and equipment came to just over $60,000 after experts documented replacement costs. Honestly, I would have traded every penny just to have my father's bandsaw back, but that wasn't possible anymore. Then Daniel suggested something that completely changed the direction of the case. "We're going to notify every homeowner affected by this annexation." I remember blinking at him. "Every homeowner?" He nodded. "Every single one." Over the next several days, surveyors confirmed what we'd suspected. 43 additional families had been pulled into the HOA under the same questionable expansion. Some had paid annual dues for years. Others had accumulated fines for fences, gardens, sheds, parking violations, even Christmas decorations. One retired school teacher named Linda showed me a folder nearly 3 inches thick containing violation notices she'd received because her vegetable garden was considered visually inconsistent with community standards. Another couple had spent $12,000 replacing a perfectly good cedar fence after the HOA demanded black aluminum instead. A widower named Frank quietly admitted he'd refinanced his house just to pay accumulated penalties because he thought ignoring them might cost him his property. Watching those conversations unfold made me realize this was never about one arrogant board president. It was about ordinary people who'd been convinced they had no choice. Daniel mailed every affected homeowner a packet containing the county survey, copies of the annexation filings, a legal explanation written in plain English, and instructions explaining their rights. We didn't pressure anyone to sue. We simply handed them facts. The response was unlike anything I'd ever seen. My phone started ringing almost immediately. Some people cried. Others apologized for believing the HOA over their neighbors. One man admitted he'd voted for several enforcement measures because he honestly believed the association was protecting everyone's investment. Within 3 weeks, 17 families joined the lawsuit, then 24, then 31. Every new plaintiff uncovered another story. Illegal towing fees, improper liens, landscaping penalties, threats of foreclosure. By the end of the second month, 44 families had signed on. Grant Holloway suddenly wasn't smiling anymore. The same man who'd leaned back comfortably behind his polished desk now began calling homeowners personally, insisting everything was a misunderstanding. He even knocked on my front door one rainy Thursday evening. I opened it and found him standing there without his usual confidence. "Walter," he said quietly, "I'd like to talk." I stepped onto the porch but didn't invite him inside. "You finally found my address?" I asked. His face tightened. "This has gotten out of hand." I couldn't help smiling a little. "Seems expensive too." He ignored the comment. "Our attorneys believe we can reach a settlement." "Our?" I asked. "Last I heard, your insurance company walked away." His eyes drifted toward the driveway where the empty foundation of my workshop still sat exposed beneath a blue tarp. "The insurance carrier is disputing coverage." "Because fraud isn't covered?" I asked. He didn't answer. Silence can be louder than shouting. Finally, he cleared his throat. "We'll pay for the building. We'll reimburse your equipment. We'll cover attorney fees." I folded my arms. "That's generous. Then we'll consider this resolved." I looked past him toward the neighborhood entrance where I'd built decorative cedar signs nearly 20 years earlier. Signs the HOA proudly advertised in every brochure without ever mentioning who'd built them. "Grant," I said, "this stopped being about my workshop the day I realized you never had the authority to touch it." His expression changed. For the first time since we'd met, I saw fear instead of arrogance. "What exactly do you want?" he asked. I answered honestly, "The truth." He shook his head. "You know that's impossible." "No," I replied. "It's just expensive." Over the following weeks, board meetings became chaotic. 3 directors resigned. Homeowners demanded financial records. Local reporters began attending meetings after court filings became public. County officials reopened the annexation file, and investigators requested every document connected to the 2020 expansion. Daniel later told me the HOA had already spent nearly $250,000 on legal fees before the case even reached trial, and every passing week made things worse because new plaintiffs kept joining. One afternoon, Linda called me laughing so hard she could barely speak. "Walter," she said, "did you hear?" "Hear what?" "They're trying to pass a special assessment to pay their lawyers." I laughed too, though not because it was funny. Imagine asking the very people you illegally govern to fund your own defense after getting caught. The proposal failed spectacularly. Homeowners who had spent years quietly following every rule suddenly found their voices. People who'd never attended a board meeting started filling every seat. Questions nobody had dared ask before echoed through the clubhouse almost every week. Where did the money go? Who approved the expansion? Why were signatures missing? Why were records incomplete? Every answer only created 3 more questions. Grant called Daniel twice trying to negotiate privately. Each time the offer got larger, first to $60,000, then $100,000, then enough to rebuild my shop twice over. Daniel never even let me consider accepting it. "If we settle now," he said, "everyone else loses." He was right. And deep down, I knew rebuilding my workshop would never rebuild what those years of unlawful control had taken from dozens of families. By the time the judge scheduled the final evidentiary hearing, the courtroom wasn't just filled with lawyers anymore. It was filled with neighbors who had finally realized that the papers they'd sign every year, the checks they'd mailed, the fines they'd quietly paid, had all been built on a foundation that might never have legally existed in the first place. And as we walked through those courthouse doors together, I had a strange feeling that whatever happened next would change far more than the empty piece of ground where my workshop once stood. Walking into that courtroom felt strangely peaceful. Maybe it was because after weeks of depositions, county records, expert reports, and endless conversations with neighbors, I already knew this day wasn't really about winning anymore. It was about finally putting the truth somewhere nobody could pretend not to see. The courtroom was packed long before the hearing began. I recognized Linda sitting beside Frank, the retired firefighter who had almost lost his home over fines he never legally owed. Young couples who'd been too intimidated to question the board were there too, sitting quietly behind their attorneys. Even a few people who had defended the HOA at neighborhood meetings nodded politely when they saw me. Nobody looked angry anymore. Mostly they looked tired. Grant Holloway walked in a few minutes later, but he barely resembled the man I'd met months earlier. The tailored suits were still there, but confidence wasn't. He avoided eye contact with nearly everyone as he sat beside his legal team. When the judge entered, the room settled into complete silence. What followed wasn't dramatic television with surprise witnesses or emotional speeches. Real courtrooms rarely work that way. Instead, the truth came out one document at a time. County surveyors testified first. They confirmed the original property boundaries hadn't changed since the late 70s. Then came planning officials, who explained the HOA expansion process, carefully walking the court through every required signature, every filing requirement, every missing document. One by one, the exhibits painted a picture that became impossible to ignore. The amended HOA boundary had been filed without complete owner consent. Internal board emails showed several directors knew additional approvals were missing, but decided to correct the paperwork later, because they believed nobody would challenge the expansion once homeowners were already paying dues. Later never came. Instead, the association spent years enforcing rules it had no legal authority to enforce. Then Daniel stood up for his closing argument. He never raised his voice. He simply walked over to the display board where photographs of my workshop stood beside photographs of the empty dirt lot left behind. This case, he said calmly, began with one destroyed building. It became something much larger because power exercised without legal authority is not governance. It's trespass wearing a necktie. You could have heard a pin drop. Grant's attorney tried arguing that the board acted in good faith, that procedural mistakes shouldn't invalidate years of community management. But the judge kept returning to one simple question. Where is the signed consent? No one could produce it because it never existed. 2 weeks later, the written decision arrived. I read every page sitting at the same kitchen table where this whole journey had started. The court ruled the annexation invalid from the beginning. Every assessment, fine, architectural citation, and enforcement action imposed on the affected properties since the expansion was declared unenforceable. The HOA was ordered to reimburse unlawfully collected fees, compensate property owners for proven damages, and because its financial obligations exceeded its available assets, the court approved a supervised dissolution process. Just like that, an organization that had spent years telling everyone else how to live simply ceased to exist. The combined judgments and settlements approached $900,000 once everything was calculated. Grant resigned before the dissolution paperwork was finalized. A few months later, I heard he'd sold his house for considerably less than he'd paid and moved across the country. Honestly, I didn't celebrate. I never hated the man. I hated what happened when someone mistakes authority for ownership and forgets the people living behind the addresses on a spreadsheet. As for me, I finally rebuilt my workshop. The new one stands on the exact same piece of ground, only this time the foundation is stronger, the roof sits a little higher, and the windows let in far more morning light than the old building ever did. My grandson Noah spends most Saturdays there with me now. He's 16, asks 1,000 questions, and somehow manages to leave sawdust in places I didn't think sawdust could reach. A few weeks ago, we finished restoring an old bandsaw almost identical to the one my father left me. It isn't the original. Nothing could ever replace that machine. But every time Noah flips the switch and smiles after making a clean cut, I like to think my dad would have smiled too. The neighborhood feels different now. People wave more often. They actually stop and talk instead of worrying whether someone's measuring their grass or counting flower pots. Ironically, local real estate agents say home values have climbed since the HOA disappeared. Turns out buyers like neighborhoods where neighbors solve problems by speaking to each other instead of threatening each other with certified letters. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd come home just one day earlier, or one day later, or if I'd simply accepted the settlement and rebuilt quietly. Maybe life would have been easier. Maybe dozens of families would have kept paying money they never legally owed. I'll never know. What I do know is this. Sometimes the smallest line on an old survey map can carry more weight than the loudest person in the room. And sometimes the strongest thing an ordinary person can do isn't getting even. It's refusing to look away when something feels wrong. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. If you discovered that an organization had been enforcing rules over your property without any legal authority, would you have accepted a private settlement and moved on? Or would you have pushed until the entire system was held accountable? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever had a difficult neighbor or power-hungry HOA. You never know whose story might be next.